A story from Disney. Let us begin. Some of you may have heard that the Disney Corporation is responsible for at least one real live ghost town. Disney built the Treasure Island Resort in Baker's Bay in the Bahamas. It didn't actually start as a ghost town. Disney's cruise ships would actually stop at the resort and leave tourists there to relax in luxury. This is a fact. Look it up. Disney blew Disney blew $30 million on this place. Yes, $30 million. Then they abandoned it. Disney blamed the shallow waters, too shallow for their ships to safely operate, and there was even blame cast on the workers, saying that since they were from the Bahamas, they were too lazy to work a regular schedule. That's where the factual nature of the story ends. It wasn't because of sand, and it obviously wasn't because of foreigners or lazy. Both are convenient excuses. Excuses. Sorry. No, I sincerely doubt those reasons were legitimate. Those reasons were legitimate. Why I don't buy the official story? Because of Malgi's place. Near the beachside city of Emerald Isle in North Carolina, Disney began construction of Mowgli's Place in the late 1990s. The concept was a jungle themed resort with a large, you guessed it, palace in the center of the whole thing. If you're unfamiliar with the character of Mowgli, you might better remember the story The Jungle Book.
Mowgli.
Mowgli, whatever. If you haven't seen it anywhere else, you know it as the Disney cartoon from decades past. Mowgli, or Mowgli, is an abandoned child in the jungle, essentially raised by animals and simultaneously threatened pursued by other animals. Mowgli's palace was a controversial undertaking from the start. Disney bought up a ton of high priced land for the project, and there was actually a scandal surrounding some of the purchases. The local government claimed eminent domain on the people's homes, then turned around and sold the people's properties to Disney. At one point, a home had just been constructed and was immediately condemned with little or no explanation. The land grab by the government was supposedly for some fictional highway project. Knowing full well what was going on, people started calling it the Mickey Mouse Highway. Then there was the concept art. A group of stuffed shirts from Disney Co. actually held a city meeting. They intended to sell everyone on how lucrative this project was going to be for everyone. Then they showed the concept art, a gigantic Indian palace surrounded by jungle, staffed with men and women in loincloths and tribal gear. Well, suffice to say, everyone flipped their shit. We're talk we're talking about a large Indian palace, jungle, and loincloths, not only in the center of a relatively wealthy area, but in also a somewhat xenophobic area at the southern United States. It was a questionable mix at that point in history. One member of the crowd tried to storm the stage, but it was quickly subdued by security after he managed to break one of the presentation boards over his knee. Disney took that community and essentially broke it over the knee as well. Houses were razed, the land was cleared, and there wasn't a damn thing anyone can do or say about it. Local TV and newspapers were against the resort at the beginning, but some insane connection between Disney's media holdings and the local venues came into play and their opinions turned on a dime. So anyway, Treasure Island, the Bahamas. Disney sunk those millions and then split. Same thing happened with Malgi's Palace. Construction was complete. Visitors actually stayed at the resort. The surrounding communities were flooded with traffic from the usual annoyances associated with an influx of lost and irate tourists. Then it all just stopped. Disney shut it down and no one knew what the hell to think. But they were pretty happy about it. Disney's loss was pretty hilarious and wonderful to a large group of folks who didn't want this in the first place. I honestly don't give I honestly didn't give the place another thought since hearing it close over a decade ago. I live maybe 4 hours from Emerald Isle, really I only heard the rumblings and didn't experience any of it firsthand. Then I read the article from someone who explored the Treasure Island Resort and posted a whole blog about the crazy shit he found there. Stuff that just left behind. Things smashed they faced, probably ruined by the disgusted, disgruntled former employees who had lost their jobs. Hell, the locals from all around probably had a hand in wrecking the place. People there just felt as angry as the Treasure Island as folks did about Mowgli's place. Tea break. I love tea. Plus, there are rumors that Disney had released their aquarium stock, quote unquote, to the local waters when they closed, including sharks. Who wouldn't want to take a few swings at some of the merchandise after that? Well, what I'm getting in what I'm getting at is that this whole blog about Treasure Island got me thinking. Even though many years have passed since its closing, I figured it might be cool to do some urban exploration of Mowgli's Palace. Keep on mispronouncing that name for fuck's sake. Take some photos, write about my experience, and probably see if the whole thing, if there was anything that I could take home as a memento. I'm not going to say I wasted no time in getting there because honestly, it took me another year after I first found that Treasure Island article to get around going to Emerald Isle. Over the course of that year, I did a lot of research on the Palace Resort, or rather, I tried to. Naturally, no official Disney site or resource made any mention of the place. That had been scrubbed clean. Even odder, however, was that nobody before myself had apparently thought that to blog this. What was odder, however, that it was that nobody before myself had apparently thought to blog about this place or even post a photo. None of the local TV or newspaper sites had one word about the place, though that was to be expected since they all had swung Disney's way. They wouldn't be out there laundering their embarrassment, you know? Recently, I learned that corporations can actually ask Google, for example, to remove links from search results, basically for no good reason. Looking back, it's probably not that nobody spoke at the resort, but rather their words were made inaccessible. So in the end, I could barely find the place. All I had to go on was the oldest hell map that I received in the mail back in the 90s. It was a promotional item sent to out to people who had recently been in Disney World, and I guess since I had been there in the late 80s, that was recent. Hold on. I didn't really intend to hang on to it. It just got shoved into my books and comics from my childhood. I'd only remembered it months into my research. Even then, it took me another few weeks to locate the storage bin that my parents shoved it all into. But I did find it. Locals were no help, as most were transplants who had removed to the beach in recent years, or old residents who just sneered at me and made rude gestures about the second I managed to say, "Where would you find Mowgli's?" The drive took me through an inordinately long corridor of overgrowth. Tropical plants that had run rampant and overpopulated the area, mixed with the native species of flora that actually belonged there and had tried to reclaim the land. I was in awe when I reached the front gates of the resort. Tremendous, monolithic wooden gates whose supports on either side looked like they must have been cut from giant sequoias. The gate itself had been gouged in several places by woodpeckers and eaten away at the base by burrowing insects. Hanging on the gate was a sheet of metal, some random scrap with hand painted letters scrawled on black. Abandoned by Disney. Clearly the handiwork of some past local or employee who wanted to make some small protest. The gates were open enough to walk through, but no drive. So grabbing my digital camera and the map, whose flip side showed the layout of the resort, I set off on foot. The inner grounds of the place were just as overgrown as the entryway. Palm trees stood unattended and ragged among piles of their own coconuts. Banana plants similarly stood on top of their own stinking, bug riddled refuse. There was this sort of clash between order and chaos, as carefully planted rows of perennial flowers mixed with obnoxious tall weeds and stinking, blackened mushrooms. All that remained of any outdoor structures was broken, rotting wood, and various charred bits of unidentifiable material. What was most likely an information booth or outdoor bar was now simply a pile a pile of assorted debris, chopped up by past vandalism and ravaged by weather. The most interesting thing about the grounds was a statue of Baobo, the friendly bear from the Jungle Book, who sort of stood in sort of a courtyard front of the main building. He was frozen in a jovial wave toward no one, staring at the empty space with a silly, toothy grin as bird shit covered a whole swath of his fur and vines ensnared his platform. I approached the main building, the palace, only to find the outside of the building was covered in graffiti where the original paint had been peeled and chipped away. The front doors weren't just open, they had been taken off their hinges and were stolen. Above the front doors, a gaping maw where they once been, someone had once again painted "Abandoned by Disney." I wish I could tell you the awesome stuff I saw inside the palace. Forgotten statues, abandoned cash registers, a full-fledged secret society of homeless bums, but no. The inside of the building was so stark, so bare, that I actually think people have stolen the molding off the walls. Anything that was too big to steal, counters, desks, giant fig trees, they were all resting amid this empty echo chamber that amplified my every step, like a slow rat-a-tat of a machine gun. I checked the floor plan and headed to all the locations that might seem in any way interesting. The kitchen is, as you'd imagine, an industrial food prep area with all the appliances and space, no expenses spared. Every glass surface was broken, every door knocked off its hinges, every metal surface kicked and dented. The entire place smelled like very old piss. The huge freezer, not even remotely cool now, had a row upon row of empty space. Hooks hung from the ceiling, probably for hanging cuts of meat. And as I stood inside for a moment, I noticed they were all swinging. Each hook swung in a random direction, but their moves were so slow and so small that it was almost impossible to see. I figured it had been caused by my footsteps, so I stopped one from swinging by clutching my fist, then carefully let it go. But in seconds, it started swinging once more. The bathrooms were in the same state as was the bathrooms was much the same state as the rest of the place. Just like the Treasure Island resort, someone had me- methodically smashed a porcelain commode with coconuts and other implements. There was about a half inch of rancid, stinking stagnant water on the floor, so I didn't stay there for very long. What's odd is that the toilets and sinks, all the bidets in the ladies' room, yes, I went in there, all dripped, leaked, or just ran freely. It seemed to me that they should have shut off the water a long, long time. There were plenty of rooms in the resort, but naturally I didn't have time to look through them all. The few I did peer into were similarly wrecked. I didn't expect to find anything else. I didn't expect to find anything there. I thought there was actually a television or radio in one room, as I really think I heard a quiet conversation coming out. Though it was like a whisper, probably my own breathing echoing the silence, or just another case of sound of flowing water playing tricks on my mind. This is what it sounded like. Number one, I don't believe it. Two, short on the reply. One, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Your father told you. One, unknown reply, or possibly just weeping. I know, that sounds ridiculous. I'm just telling you what I experienced. Why I thought might have been something running in that room. Worse, some Vangress would have holed up there and probably would have knifed me. The front doors of the palace again, I figured I haven't found anything of note and I had wasted the trip up. As I looked at the door, as I looked at the door though, I noticed something interesting in the courtyard that I apparently missed. Something that would have given me at least one thing to show for all my trouble, if it was just a photograph. There it was. There was a lifelike statue of a python, maybe 80 feet long, curled up and sunning itself, and a pedestal right in the center of the area. It was almost like it was almost time for the sun to start setting, so the light fell on the object in a perfect way for a photograph. I approached a python and snapped a photo. Then I stood on my toes and snapped another, then closer again to get the details of its face. Slowly and casually, the python lifted its head, looked directly in my eyes, and slid it off the pedestal, across the glass into the trees. All 80 feet of it. Its head long disappeared into the woods before its tail left the stunning spot. Disney had released all their exotic animals. Right there on my floor plan, the map was Reptile House. I should have known. I read all about the sharks at Treasure Isle. So I should have known they've done this. I was dumbfounded, just utterly stupefied. My mouth must have been hanging open for the longest time before I came back down to earth and snapped it shut. I blinked a few times and backed my way from where the snake had been, back toward the palace. Even though it was totally gone, even though it was totally gone, I still wasn't taking any chances and backed my way into the building. I took a few deep breaths and slaps of my own face to get myself right in the head after all that. I looked in the I looked for a place to sit down, as my legs were feeling a bit like jelly at this point. Of course, there was no place to sit down unless I wanted to recline on broken glass and dead leaf carpet or haul myself on a desk of questionably reliability. I had seen some stairs near the palace's lobby and decided to go have a seat there until I felt better. The staircase was far enough away of the front of the building relatively clean, save for a startling accumulation of dust. I pulled a wedge of metal off the wall, once again painted with the abandoned by Disney model that I've been accustomed to. I placed I placed the wedge on the stairs and sat on it to keep at least somewhat clean. The stairway led downward, below ground level. Using my camera flash as sort of an improvised flashlight, I could see through the I could see that the staircase ended as a metal mesh door with a padlock. I read the sign on the door. The sign on the door, a real sign, read "Mascots only, thank you." This perked up my spirits for a little bit for two reasons. One, a mascots only area would have definitely been had some interesting stuff back in the day. Two, the padlock was still in place. Nobody had gone down there. Not the vandals, not the looters, nobody. This was the one place where I can actually explore and perhaps find something interesting to photograph, or want to only steal. I had come to the place essentially agreeing myself that it was okay to take anything I wanted because, hey, abandoned. It didn't take much to bust a lock. Well, actually, it's wrong. That's wrong. I didn't. It didn't take much for me to bust a metal plate and wall the padlock was hooked to. Time the Gay had done most of the work for me, as I was able to bend the metal plate enough to pull the screws out of the wall. Something no one else had apparently thought of, or haven't able to do it at the time. The mascots only area was a startling and very welcome change for the rest of the building. For one, every second of or third of fluorescent light overhead was illuminated, even though they flickered and faded randomly. Also, nothing had been stolen or broken, even if age and exposure were definitely taking their toll. Tables had notepads and pens. There were clocks, even punching clocks on the wall to compete with filled out time cards. Chairs were scattered around. There was even a small break room with an old static filled television and long rotted out food with drinks on the counters. It was like one of those post apocalyptic movies where everything was left in a state of evacuation. As I walked in a maze like sub basement for as I walked in the maze like sub basement hallways of the mascot area, the sights had just become more and more interesting. As I went further, desks and tables were knocked over, papers scattered and almost melted with the damp floor, and a large carpet of mold was slowly overtaking the real rotting crimson floor covering. Something was sort of squishy. Anything wood disintegrated into mush even when I applied even the least amount of force. And clothing items hanging in the hooks in one of the rooms simply fell into the moist threads if I tried to unhook them. One thing that annoyed me the most One thing that annoyed me was that the light was coming more and more sparse and unreliable as I went further into the dark. suffocating the depths of the place. Eventually, I reached a black and yellow striped door with the words Character Prep 1 stenciled in it. Door wouldn't open at first. I figured this was probably where costumes were kept, and I definitely want to take a photograph of that twisted, stinking mess. Try as I might, whatever angle or trick I tried, the door wouldn't budge. That was until I gave up starting to walk away. There was a slight popping sound and the door creaked open slowly. Inside, the room was completely dark, pitch black. I used a camera flash to look for a light switch in the wall by the door, but there was nothing. As I made my search, I was jarred out of my sense of excitement by a loud electrical buzz. Rows of lights overhead suddenly flashed to life, flickering and fading in like the rest I had passed. It took a second for my eyes to adjust, and it seemed like the light was going just keep getting brighter until the bulb exploded. But just when I thought it would reach a critical stage, the lights dimmed for a bit and steadied. The room was exactly as I pictured it. Various Disney costumes hung on the walls, fully put together like a strange cartoon cadavers hung with invisible nooses. There was an entire rack of loincloths and native, quote unquote, clothes on the hangers toward the back. What I found odd, and I wanted to take a photograph right away, was a Mickey Mouse costume in the center of the room. Unlike the other costumes, it was lying on his back at the center of the floor like a murder victim. The fur of the costume was rotten and shedding, creating bare patches. What was even odder, however, was the coloring of the costume. It was like a photo negative of the actual Mickey Mouse. Black where it should be white, and white where it should be. His normal red overalls were light blue. The sight was off-putting enough that I actually put a photographing the thing to last. The sight was off-putting enough that I actually put it photographing the thing to the last. To last. I took a picture of the costumes hanging from the walls. Upward angles, downward angles, side shots to show an entire row of frozen, putrid cartoon faces, some with plastic eyes missing. Then I decided to stage a shot. Just one of the bed-ragged characters' heads on the slick, grimy floor. I reached for the headpiece of Donald Duck costume and carefully removed it so the thing wouldn't fall apart in my hands. As I looked in the face of the wide-eyed, moldering head, a large clattering sound that made me jump with fright. As I looked down at my feet, there between my shoes was a human skull. It had fallen out of the mascot head and shattered into pieces at my feet. Only the empty face of the lower jaw remained, staring up at me. I jumped the duck head to the floor immediately, as you'd expect, and I moved for the door. As I stood at the doorway, I looked back to the skull on the floor. I had to take a picture of it, you know? I had to. For any number of reasons, it may seem silly, but only if you didn't think it through. I needed some proof of what happened, especially if Disney was going to somehow make this go away. I had no doubt in my mind right from the start that even if this was a gross negligence, Disney was responsible for this. That's when Mickey, the photo negative, opposite Mickey on the middle of the floor, started to get up. First sitting up, then climbing to his feet. The Mickey Mouse costume, or whoever was inside of it, stood there in the center of the room, its fake face just staring directly into me as I mumbled, "No," over and over and over. With shaking hands and a violently thrashing heart, and legs that had once again turned into jelly, I managed to lift the camera and aim it at the opposite creature now quietly sizing me up. The digital camera screen displayed only dead pixels in the shape of the thing. It was a perfect silhouette of the Mickey costume. Jesus Christ, it scared me. As the Mickey Mouse camera moved unsteadily in my hands, the dead pixels spread, marring the screen, whatever Mickey's outline moved to. Then the camera died. It went blank and quiet and broken. I raised my hands once again to the Mickey Mouse costume. "Hey!" it said in a hushed, perverted, but perfectly executed Mickey Mouse voice. "Wanna see my head come off?" He started to pull at his own head, working at it clumsily, glove-clad fingers around its neck with a clawing, impatient movements, similar to a wounded man trying to pull himself free from a predator's jaws. As it worked in the digits of his neck, so much blood, so much thick, chunky, yellow blood. I turned away as I heard a sickening tearing of cloth and flesh, only caring that about getting away. Above the doorway of this room, I saw the final message clawed into the metal and bone with 4 fingernails. Abandoned by God. I never got any of the pictures out of the camera. I never wrote a point. I never wrote a blog post about this. After I ran from the place, I fled for my own sanity, if not for my life. I knew why Disney didn't want anyone to know about this place. They didn't want anyone like me getting in, and they didn't want anything like that getting out. There